Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Sayers. I'm a research scientist at AWS. I'm part of our professional services team, so I work with customers, including those customers who are bringing Nextflow to AWS. And so what I want to do today is go over some different choices and considerations if you were to be bringing your workflows to AWS, and kind of as you assess how you want to run your workflow. And so the main question I want to do is basically look at if you were a user coming to AWS, you have your Nextflow workflow, how do you run on AWS? There's a variety of services. Are there better ways to run it than others? And so also to frame this, I want to go over a couple of key considerations. Look at each of those different services. There are things like expertise, where especially the different orchestrators or resource schedulers, having that existing expertise is something you want to weigh as you're kind of evaluating the different services. Likewise, different workloads. Are you bringing just a set of Nextflow workflows, or are you bringing basically all of an HPC to AWS and you have a variety of different workflows? Next, one of the considerations is the configuration. And this is both the Nextflow configuration that enables you to work with the different services, as well as the actual configuration available to you within those services. So things like different EC2 instances or storage that might be available depending on the service you're using. And then finally, the integration with the larger set of AWS services, if you want to plug it into some other sort of business logic to accomplish your workflow needs. And so again, these are just kind of some of the things to keep in mind as you're looking at the different services, and I'll try to highlight, as with the specific services, some of the areas from these that kind of stand out for a given service. So the three services I want to talk about today are basically those that enable you to create your own cluster in AWS and run Nextflow. And so we'll be looking at AWS Batch, which is probably the one most people in this room are familiar with. But it's a fully managed batch processing service. Also AWS Parallel Cluster. And this is a way to create a Slurm cluster on top of EC2 instances and have that very traditional HPC environment. And then finally, Amazon EKS, which is our managed Kubernetes offering. And so first what I want to do, and this might be very familiar to everyone, but kind of step through what a somewhat generic workflow analysis on Nextflow looks like in terms of the architectures, and then also highlight some of the different key components. And here I'm using Batch kind of as an exemplar, but the key bits are actually shared between Parallel Cluster and EKS as well. And so kind of walking through this, initially you have a user who has a Nextflow file as well as a config file. And this is setting basically the executor for a given service. So again, here, this is just using Batch as an exemplar. Then that AWS service is going to take in the jobs that are specified in the processes in the Nextflow workflow and basically send this into a compute environment. And so this compute environment is then the EC2 instances. And so you have a full menu of different EC2 instances that you can plug into your compute environment and get different accelerators or optimized instances for things like compute and memory or HPC. Then the other piece of this is, of course, that you need some way to pull in your tools. And obviously Nextflow supports a variety. I've got Conda, containers, et cetera. So here just using an example of pulling in a container. So this pulls into the compute environment and is run on top of those EC2 instances. And then the last piece of the puzzle is then having some storage. So here just using S3, both for the work directory as well as the inputs and outputs and whatnot. And so again, this is using Batch as an exemplar, but the key things here, also shared by Parallel Cluster as well as EKS, is basically that you have some EC2 compute, you have a variety of different storage options, and then you have ways to host and manage the tools you're using, all behind an AWS service that Nextflow can then be configured to use. So stepping through the services individually, I just want to do some highlights as well as a bit of the Nextflow configuration that might differ between them. So for those of you who are not familiar with AWS Batch, it's a fully managed job schedule and resource orchestration. So if you're familiar with an HPC scheduler, this is basically a fully managed version of that in AWS. And with minimal configuration, you have a fully specialized batch scheduler available to you that you can then configure Nextflow to run jobs on. It's highly integrated with other AWS services. And then you have quite a lot of flexibility in terms of setting up different queues and EC2 instances in your compute environments to leverage all of that for your workflows and kind of fine-tune it for you. And this one is probably the one most people are most familiar with. I think it's one of the oldest managed services supported by Nextflow. And then also it's widely documented both from AWS, Nextflow, Sakara, and like community blogs. So this one's very widely used. The next service, which is actually a tool, is AWS Parallel Cluster. And so this is an open source tool that enables you to create a Slurm cluster on top of EC2 instances. And so here you have it takes in a YAML file. And so in tens of lines of YAML, you're able to define the different instance types you need, the different storage you might use, and then within a matter of minutes to tens of minutes, you're able to deploy a full HPC cluster on top of EC2. And so one of the key advantages here is that it's that very traditional HPC setup. You have like a login node, you log in, you have srun, sbatch available to you. And going back to kind of those key considerations I mentioned at the start, this one particularly can enable if you have like very heterogeneous workloads. So perhaps you have some Nextflow workflows, you have some other HPC workflows, such as like molecular dynamics or whatnot. You're able to provide that very familiar environment to researchers on AWS and enable kind of the variety of different workflows that they could use. And one of the other things here to call out as well is that Parallel Cluster has a bit more flexibility in terms of the different tool dependencies. So whereas Batch and EKS are primarily container focused, this one you can use Conda, SPAC modules, local installs and whatnot. So you have a bit more flexibility in terms of how you're managing the software you're running in your workflow. So the next service is then the Amazon EKS, and this is the managed Kubernetes service. It has a number of advantages. First off, you have some redundancy in terms of the control plane. And so you have some redundancy, and it's all managed by AWS. And you also have the ability to use the managed node groups from EKS. And so here you're able to change out instances in your node groups fairly quickly, and it's a fairly straightforward process. And so again, this allows you to have that fine-tuning capability as you're looking at your workflows to kind of swap out the instances as needed to address the resource requirements. And then one of the big things, similar to how in Slurm you're considering additional workloads, those might be HPC. Here in Kubernetes, you can also look at other workloads that might be also supported here. And so like there's a number of different like data science tools and stuff that run on top of Kubernetes. And so this is another consideration. As you're looking at it, there are potentially other services that you're using that could also then be hosted in Kubernetes beside your Nextflow execution. So the next thing I want to mention, kind of looking back at the services, so Batch is heavily container focused, EKS is heavily container focused, and then Parallel Cluster also enables the use of containers within Slurm. And so one of the other services we have is Amazon ECR, and this is our managed container registry. And so this is another piece of the puzzle, kind of going back to that original exemplar workflow run, that you can also have this in your Amazon account, and then there's some benefits to hosting your containers in ECR, and then pulling into Batch and EKS in your Amazon account. And the other thing I wanted to mention here was that the ECR also now has all of biocontainers in it as of last year. So again, a common community resource is also available to you in ECR to use as well. So looking back at the initial considerations, and of course this was a very quick overview just to kind of give you that first taste of the different services. But looking back at the considerations we talked about, so expertise here is obviously an important one. If you have users that are already familiar with Slurm or Kubernetes, kind of enabling them to have that similar environment, but in AWS obviously has a lot of value and kind of is less disruptive to that like time to science compared to dropping them in a totally new environment. Additionally, in terms of expertise, Some of the other things we talked about were the instances and storage. So, expertise in managing specific storage types can also be considered. And then looking at the different workloads is also important. Again, it kind of differs a bit if you're looking at just pulling in a handful of Nextflow workflows versus, basically an entire HPC system of workloads into AWS. And so that's a big thing to consider then, going back to kind of the parallel cluster and EKS in particular. If you have something that requires Kubernetes, maybe it's a visualization service, or if you have different HPC workloads, again, that require like tightly coupled processing, that's all something to weigh as well as you're kind of comparing the services further. The next bit is to also look at the configuration. And again, we didn't kind of really dive into that too deeply in this presentation, but there are slight differences in terms of the EC2 instance types that are supported by the different services, different storage classes that can be used with the different services. And so that's also something to investigate as you're kind of doing your search and how you want to run your workflows in Nextflow, taking that kind of holistic view and understanding what the different services support and which different features you might be able to leverage to run your workflows. And the final one, we also didn't really touch on this either, is the integrations. And so this is really the ability to connect up one of these services to other AWS services. So you can think of this basically if you had like an S3 bucket and you wanted to react to as data is being put into the S3 bucket, have some trigger, how can you connect it up to other AWS services that can respond to that trigger? And so again, this differs slightly between the services. Some are very fully integrated, some require a couple additional steps to get that type of integration. And so what I wanted to do in conclusion is basically, again, this was a very quick high-level overview, didn't dive too deep into anything, but at least now hopefully you have some context if you were to say, I have my Nextflow workflow, how do I run on AWS? And so we have basically a number of different services that have different features and can support different use cases and different expertise. And so we have kind of a variety of different options for you to consider as you're agreeing workload. And then the other portion is kind of going to what Ankit was also saying in his presentation. The key components within the different services, we have a wide menu of things like EC2 instances, everything from HPC optimized to compute optimized. We have x86, we have ARM, we have a new ARM processor that was also announced earlier this week. And likewise, a variety of different storage options to meet your kind of workflow requirements and different portions of that. And finally, we have the ability to host the containers so you can have all your tools pulled in. And so just kind of, and as an overall conclusion, basically there are a lot of options and you can kind of find what works best for you and really fine-tune both how you're running your workflows as well as the infrastructure you're running those workflows on top of. And so yeah, hopefully that just gives you, if you had not looked at AWS before, hopefully that gives you a bit of a roadmap of some things to look at. And with that, thank you everyone. Thank you for the organizers, and I'm happy to take questions now if there's time, or stop me anytime.
Yeah, we can take a couple of questions real quick. Thank you very much. Are there any generic batch Nextflow infrastructure plans out there, like Terraform, for example?
So we have some workshops that provide, I don't know if we have a Terraform specific one, but there are workshops out there that have kind of a blueprint for doing it. And then of course there are also a number of like community ones as well as like blog posts from Sakara that kind of outline what you would do.
Very well, thank you. Are there any guidelines on how to configure split cost allocation reporting so that we can more easily track costs associated with specific Nextflow jobs running on AWS batch?
So there has been, this is maybe perhaps a little too much to dive into right now, but there are different tools that have been released over the past year that give you more fine-grained control of monitoring of both the costs and resource utilizations of batch. So there are different options out there. So I'm definitely happy to dive into that further if you stop me or reach out. So we are kind of constantly evolving how we can track that, both the resources and costs. So we have some solutions.
Wonderful. There's a few other questions, but we're out of time, so I encourage you to seek out Kevin at the coffee break, and if you can join Slack to engage in the conversation, that'd be wonderful.
Definitely.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.